Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Avodah Zarah Samaches 68. We'll start on 67b, 200. In the bottom of the Gemara is recorded a machlokes, a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Meir. That Rabbi Meir says no same time of gam. If you impart a bad taste, it's going to be prohibited. It's still prohibited. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says if you impart a bad taste, no same time of gam is permitted. Gemara says Rabbi Shimon my taima. How does Rabbi Shimon know that no same time of gam is permitted? That if it imparts a bad taste, it's permitted. Gemara says it's based upon a pasuk that dichsev it states. Now, here it says the Tanya, but when there's parallel source sending suba, it says dichsev. You're not allowed to eat any carcass. You shall give the carcasses to the foreigner who's in your city, which means kol haru'uyo ger kruya nevela. Anything which the ger would eat, which the foreigner would eat, is going to be called a nevela, a carcass. But if it's not something she'ein ru'uyo ger, but if it's not something that he would eat, ein a kruya nevela. It's not called a nevela, and therefore it's not prohibited. Rashi says shehisricha, that it had been ruined. We're on top of 68a. Alma the ifkim patel isur, that once it became not edible, it lost its prohibited status. So that's why we're talking about the gelatin. It goes to a state where it's no longer prohibited.
Because it reaches a state that's not edible.
Exactly.
And once it's not edible, it like restarts.
But I said that the problem with that is that's the way many food items are produced, that they're not edible at a certain point. Like a lot of dehydrated foods or all this processed food goes through this part where it's not edible. If you allow that, you're basically allowing a lot of foods. Rabbi Meir says, Hahila miyute srucha meikar. Rabbi Meir says, no, that pasuk is to tell us not that no sin tam of gam is permitted, but to tell us that if it was srucha meikara, that if it was not edible initially, not that it became not edible, that it was not edible as muka shchum michayim, it was diseased. That since Rashi says the whole ifkama mikolim shabali de nevela, since it became not edible before it became a carcass, v'chal shem nevela out. It never is called a nevela. But avohechad itzar meikara suo paka isar mishum pagan. But where it became prohibited initially as a carcass, then the prohibition never disappears. So Rabbi Shimon's other position that if it gives off a bad taste, it's permitted. The Rabbi Meir says no. That pasuk is to exclude the case of srucha meikar where it was sick. So Rabbi Shimon would say srucha meikar or srucha meyuta. It doesn't even need a pasuk to tell us that if it was srucha meikar. Why? Afra ba'almahu. It's just dirt. So therefore, it's for sure not in the category of nevela. So Amar Ula, so now Ula says this machlokes where Rabbi Shimon says no sin tam of gam is permitted, and Rabbi Meir says no sin tam of gam is prohibited. This is a machlokes only she'eshpiach. It's only an argument she'eshpiach ubesof pagam, where initially speaking it improved its status, but in the end it got ruined. So that's where Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon argue. But aval pagam meikara, but let's say right when this non-kosher item fell into the pot, it ruined it or it made it worse. Divrei kol mutar. According to Ula, even Rabbi Meir would say it's permitted if initially speaking it made it better. Under those circumstances, even Rabbi Meir would say it's permitted. So the Gemara says, well, let's challenge Ula from a case that we were discussing in yesterday's daf. You mean to say that even according to Rabbi Meir, if it initially falls in, it's going to be, and gives it a bad taste, it's going to be permitted. So Rav Chaga challenges Ula from the case of Yayin Shinafal L'toch Hadashim, V'chomet Shinafal L'toch Krisin. If we have non-kosher wine, yes, Bill?
when you go through this analysis, is the time taken into account the amount of the flavor? In other words, it has to do with
Shishim.
shishim.
So Balav Shishim is taste. So taste is only an issue if it. So that's the whole point. We're assuming it gives off a flavor. If it wouldn't give a flavor, it would be nullified. So here we're talking about a case where it gives off a flavor, but the flavor is bad. So that's where Rabbi Meir says it's still not kosher. Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher.
Does this mean it's definitely more than 60th?
Yeah, if it would be less than a 60th, it wouldn't give off flavor. The 60th is just when we can't determine whether or not it gives off flavor, we say a 60th. That's what Rashi said. So where you can't determine the flavor, you go by a 60th. Where you
It's less than the 60th, and it does. Or is it a flat assumption?
So that's a different question. That's a different question. The 60th is when you can't determine if there's a flavor. So if you can taste the flavor, then it's a problem. Sometimes you have things that are there for a very minute amount, but they still give flavor, and then it's a problem. And then it's considered giving a flavor. But sometimes you can't determine it. So then, like, for example, if the item that you're trying to figure out is not kosher, how are you going to determine if it gives off flavor? So then you say if it's 60th, it's nullified. Anyway, going back to our Gemara. So the Gemara says, it always says the only dispute is where it initially gave off a good flavor and now it gives off a bad flavor. That's where Rabbi Meir says it's prohibited. But if from the outset it gave off a bad flavor, even Rabbi Meir would say it's permitted. So Rav Chaga challenges Ula from the case of non-kosher wine that falls on lentils or non-kosher vinegar that falls on beans is also Rabbi Shimon Matir. So there the case is Rabbi Meir says it's prohibited and Rabbi Shimon says it's permitted. Here, right when it falls on the beans, it makes it's bad. We said that if the vinegar falls on hot beans, it makes it bad right away. And still he says it's prohibited. So how can Ula say Rameir say it's permitted? So Amr Ula says, he says, he says, Chaga has no idea what the rabbis are saying. And yet he still tries to challenge me and raise a refutation. Like we had discussed yesterday, that vinegar is bad if it falls on hot beans, but if it falls on good beans, it's good for the flavor. So that's what we're talking about here. No, it fell onto the cold beans, which initially improved the flavor, and then it became hot. So that's the case of that's the kamisha hishpiachol b'sof pagam va'aser. It's like it was first improved it, and then it became bad, and therefore it's prohibited. And so therefore that's exactly where Ula was saying. Rabbi Meir argues. So the Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Ula. Rabbi Yochanan says, "B'poge mikara machokes." Now, even where it initially speaking is bad, even there it's going to be, even there Ula would say it's prohibited. Even there would be the dispute. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's position. So they say when Rabbi Yochanan says that when the dispute between Meir and Shimon is where it's initially giving off a bad flavor, but what is he saying? Wait, so says the Gemara, what does this mean? Does it mean when he initially disputes it, that's the dispute? But if it got improved and then went bad, then Rabbi Shimon would agree with Rabbi Meir that's prohibited. Or maybe if they argue in both scenarios, where it's initially bad and also it was initially good and then went bad. Take it. We don't know what Rabbi Yochanan said in that scenario. We leave it unresolved. Amar of Amram, Afshar Isa lahad Rabbi Yochanan lo tanya b'masnisin. Is it possible the Rabbi Yochanan's position, which is that even where it was initially bad, Rameir would say it's prohibited. Is it possible that was taught and there's no source for it? So nafak dak va'asha. He went out and he found the Tanan. It says in the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Seor shalchuan. What's seor? Do you know what seor is, Kiva? Seor is sourdough. So they used this dough to. They didn't sell yeast in a package like Fleischmann's yeast. They didn't sell that. They used the sourdough to insert the yeast into the item. So that was basically their yeast. Seor shalchuan. So you have the yeast of the chuan. Shenafo tocha isa, and it fell into a mixture of dough. So it's kosher yeast fell into dough. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz. And there's enough there to cause it to rise, to cause it to ferment. V'chmitza, and it does it. V'achakach nafal sor shel truma. O sor shel koyakem. And afterwards fell in either the yeast of truma, which would make it prohibited to non-kohanim, or the yeast of koyakem, which would make it prohibited to everyone. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz. And there, it does have enough to cause it to ferment. So we don't want it to ferment too much. If the dough ferments too much, it's no good. So it's basically no sin tamaf gam. So right away when it falls in, it's prohibited. Right away when it falls in, it's bad. So it's initially speaking no sin tamaf gam. Aser, Rabbi Shimon matir. So the Tanakama there prohibits it, even though it's initially speaking bad. Rabbi Shimon allows it. So v'hahacha the pagame karahu here is initially speaking bad. And there's a debate, upuigi. And so we see from here that that's the source of what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Rabbi Zera says, no. Shani Isa, the case of the dough is very different. Why? It's not really bad. The dough, when it falls in, even though it over ferments the dough, even though the yeast over ferments the dough, it's still not terrible. Because you could still use it to make other cases, other doughs to rise. You could use it as a starter dough to make other doughs rise. And so therefore, even though you can't eat this, nevertheless, you could still use it. So it's not bad. So therefore, that's why the Tanakama here would say it's prohibited. No, definitely not, because it could make the other truma dough also. You can make other truma doughs from it. So it's by you could still use it. You could still use it. Okay, so now, Tashma, so we're on the bottom of 68a. Again, we're trying to see if a source for Rabbi Yochanan's position that there's a dispute even where the item that falls in is initially deleterious to the food item. That some will say it's prohibited there. That Rabbi Meir would say it's prohibited in that situation, even though it's initially bad. So we have a brisa. This brisa will have 4 parts to it. You have to remember that 4 parts to this brisa, 4 different scenarios, 4 different cases. Case number 1, so or shel truma v'shel chulin shenafu l'tocha isa. So you have some yeast of truma and chulin, 2 separate yeasts that fell in at the same time. Each one has enough to cause it to ferment on its own. Vichim too, and it ferments as a consequence. So therefore, it ferments it too much. Rashi says that's a scenario. So under those circumstances, aser, it's prohibited. Whereas Rabbi Shimon matir. Rabbi Shimon says it's permitted because it ruins it. And the other position is that it's permitted because it's the other position is it's prohibited because he says even though it's no sin time of gam, it's prohibited. But Rabbi Shimon allows it. Case number 2, nafal shel truma tchila. Let's say that truma fell in first, and divrei kol aser. Everybody would say it's prohibited to a non-kohen. Why? Because you want the yeast there, and it's improving it at the outset. And even though later on it helps ruin it when the chulin yeast falls in, and then together they're ruining it. Well, that's certainly a case of mashpiach u'basov pogumach. Therefore, initially improves, and in the end prohibits it, and that is prohibited. So okay, that's the second case. that the truma fell in, and then afterwards the chulin fell in. So nafal shel truma chilul divrei kol asar. So that's the third scenario. Nafal shel chulin v'achach nafal shel truma. The third scenario is that the regular yeast fell in, and then the truma yeast, or prohibited klayim fell in, aser. The Tanna Kama says it's prohibited, and Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon allows it. So even in a case where it's initially bad, it's going to be prohibited. So that's like Rabbi Yochanan saying that's what Rabbi Meir's position is, that even in a case where it's initially bad, it's prohibited. That's not the problem. Of course, that's not a problem. That's kosher. That's the chulin. But I'm saying, but the right when the truma falls in, it is initially giving off. You don't want it there because it's ruining the food, and still he says it's prohibited. So here in this case, right when the truma falls in, it ruins it. And there's still a dispute. So therefore, that's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that they argue in that case. And if you want to say, well, on the top of 68b, no, we already said it's not necessarily the case that this supports Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe like Rabbi Zera, it doesn't. Because why? Because you don't mind that that it's over fermented, because now you could use it as a starter to elsewhere. No, we're not going to say that. Tashma miseifa. We can learn it out from the next clause. This is the fourth clause. Hayayin shenafo atoch hadash and mechomet shenafo atoch grisin. Fourth clause of the brisa says that if it falls into the lentils or the vinegar falls into the beans, also Rabbi Shimon matir. So there it's prohibited. Rabbi Shimon allows it. There too. It was initially bad, and they argue. And if you want to say, no, this is not a case where it was initially bad, it's like Ula told Rabbi Chaga, that they fell into cold beans, and then they heated them up, so that it was initially good, and then bad. There, no, Rabbi Shimon would also say it's prohibited. It says in the case where the truma fell in first, and then the chulin, divrei kol aser. Everybody would say that if it was hishpiach b'sof pagam, if it was good and then bad, it's prohibited. Elav shmami na. So it must be from here that the case of the wine is the pagam meikara machokas. That where it's initially bad, that's the dispute. And shmami na, exactly like Rabbi Yochanan taught. Now the Gemara says, Hani Tosi Babi Dikatani Lamali. These three scenarios that the Brisa talks about, why do we need all three? First of all, there's a whole question. What do you mean these three scenarios? We just said that the Brisa is 4 scenarios. So what do you mean by these 3 scenarios? So Rashi says that it's not referring to Rashi says that Rashi tells us what it's talking about. Reisha, the first case is Heicha Dinafu Ka'achas, where they fell in together, and it's teaching us they're arguing. The middle case is where the Truma fell in first, and the last case is where the wine fell in and then the lentils. But it skips the case of where the chulin fell in first. Others say, no, it's talking about the 3 scenarios, not counting the wine. That's what Tosfos says. But anyway, Hani Tosig Bavi Dikatani. So the first case is where they fell in together. Why do we need all 3? Bishlam Abava de Seifa. I understand the last one, the case of the wine we need. Kamash Milan is teaching us, like Rabbi Yochanan taught, but Poge Meichar Machokas, that even where they initially argued, that's the dispute. And Mitziasa Nami, also I need the middle case, which Rashi says is where the Truma fell in first, because why? It's teaching us Ishbiachu b'sof pogam divrei kol aser. It's telling us that Rabbi Shimon would say it's even prohibited in that case, where it initially improved and then became prohibited and then became bad. That even Rabbi Shimon, who says no sin tam of kam, would say that it is permitted, that is prohibited in that case. Why do we need the case? Rashi's explanation of this where they both fall in together. Just like in the Seifa, just like in the case where the wine and the lentils fell in, and there the lo kamishabeach klal, that it's not where it fell initially speaking into the wine and the lentils, and it's not improving it at all. Asri Rabbanan, the rabbis say it's prohibited. Meaning, say, why do we need to learn that the rabbis prohibited in the case where the truma and the chulin fall in together? If they're going to fall, if where there's no improvement in the flavor at all, where it falls on the wine, and where the vinegar falls on the hot lentils and ruins it, the rabbis still say it's prohibited. For sure, if it's partially good, the rabbis should say it's prohibited. So that's the case. So El Reisha Lam Umase for the Kamishabeach Klalas Rabbanan Reisha that Kamishabeach in the first clause here, where it's possibly helping it because it's working in combination with the chulin. We buy it. Why they need to tell us that that even in that case, the rabbis say it's prohibited. So Amar Abaye, Reisha or Rabbi Shimon. No, we need Reisha for Rabbi Shimon, who says no sin tam lefgam is permitted. It's telling us in this case, Rabbi Shimon is still permitting it. This is what the rabbis are saying to Rabbi Shimon. Isa zu uyolahachmet b'shtei shaos migaram washatachmet b'sha'achas isur. The rabbis are saying to Rabbi Shimon, now because of this truma dough, it's leavening quicker, it's rising quicker. So therefore, you should prohibit it because it's aiding the leavening process. Why would you say it's permitted? Rabbi Shimon would say, "Kishpichu shneim hishpichu, kishepagmu shneim pagmu." Rabbi Shimon would say, no. It's true when they're both improving, that's good. But when they are both ruining it, they're also both ruining it together, and so therefore it's going to be permitted. So the Gemara says, "Rabbi Shimon litzarif heter v'isur ba'adadi v'litzar." So the Gemara asks a different question. This is a little bit contradicting, or it's related to a sugya that we had earlier in Avodah Zarah. Which sugya is? Very good, Akiva. That two items together are combining zev and zegoren. So according to Rabbi Shimon, if he's saying let's dive heter the isur, we should combine the permitted dough with the prohibited dough, and say say it's prohibited. Look at Rashi, mishum mashpiach u'b'sof pagim, because it's improving it and in the end it's ruining it. The Modi Rabbi Shimon bought, so therefore it's initially good for the food because they're both combining and fermenting it, and then in the end it's bad. But everybody says if it's mashpiach u'b'sof pagim, it's a problem. Mar says Rabbi Shimon watamei. No, Rabbi Shimon says that two items can combine. Rabbi Shimon says, "Afil isur v'isur nami lo mitztarfi." We don't combine two items to make it prohibited. Zev zegorem. Rabbi Shimon says it's completely permitted, even if they're both prohibited items. It has to be prohibited all on its own in order for it to be prohibited. And how do we know this? The Tanya we learn in a brayso. Rabbi Shimon Omer that to give off flavor, let's say you have a food item that is arla, and you have another food item that's koya kerem, and neither one on their own is giving off flavor, but to combine they give off flavor. Rabbi Shimon says it's still permitted. Now we have a case which we studied a lot in Yoredea. This one mouse fell into a barrel of beer, and it really stuck with us for all of Yoredea. Huach bara, there was a mouse. Tinafel chavisa de shechra, fell into a barrel of beer. Asrei, and presumably it was there for 24 hours because otherwise it's not hot. So how did it transmit the flavor? So a mouse fell there, and if something stays in something, even if it's cold, if it stays there for 24 hours, it could give off the flavor. So that's what happened. We had this mouse that fell there into the barrel of beer, and Asrei Rabba Ushechra. Rav said that beer is prohibited. He says it's prohibited. Even though they removed the mouse and it's just as a flavor. And presumably, you don't want the taste of a mouse in your beer. Presumably, you don't want a rat taste in your beer, right? Rat urine, nobody likes. So you would think, but we're going to see it's not necessarily the case, and nobody likes it. So Asa Rav who shecher Amar Rabbanan Kamed Rav Sheshis. So why is Rav prohibiting it? Do you want to say that he's of the position? There must be that Rav is of the position like Rabbi Meir, that noticing tam with gam is aser. Name a kosaver noticing tam with gam is aser. It must be that Rav is of the position that if it's giving off a bad taste, it's still prohibited. No. He said no. Amar Lahu Rav Sheshes, but Alma Sava Rav noticing tam with gam is mutter. No, maybe Rav's of the position that if it gives off a bad taste, in general, we'll say it's permitted. But this case, chiddush usually means it's a new concept, but here it means it's like sui generis. It's its own content, its own category. Meaning to say, normally we say, this is not exactly how Rashi says it, but other Rishonim explain like this. Normally, everything, if it gives off a bad taste, is permitted. But the mouse that the Torah prohibits, obviously the mouse is giving off a bad taste, and the Torah says it's prohibited, it must mean that even though it gives off a bad taste, it's still prohibited. Because why else would the Torah tell us if it anyways gives off a bad taste? So that's the logic here. It's not the way Rashi explains it, but that's the way some of the other Rishonim explain it. So he says, but here the Torah tells us it's prohibited, even though we would have known it anyway that's prohibited because it gives off a bad taste. Because it's disgusting. People, nobody wants it in their food. And the Torah still says it's prohibited. So even if it gives off a taste into the food item that ruins it, it's still going to be prohibited. So that's why Rav is saying, generally, Rav would agree nosim tam of gam is permitted, but in the case of the mouse, he says the Torah tells us it's prohibited, so even though it gives off a bad taste, it's prohibited. So, well, if that's the case, I'm just saying like this. This happens actually not as often today, but you see like they talk a lot about, let's say you have an animal got into, like if you have communal cooking and like you find a rat in there, and you take out the rat or a mouse and you eat it. Is it noticing time with gam then? Like let's say in the cholent they find like a cat or something. Also, it's also possible that like in those days they were more likely to eat it. But now, and we'll see, some people thought it was okay. But nowadays everybody's disgusted by it. I don't know anybody who would find it like, if most of our kitchens, if anybody saw there was a dead mouse in their food and they took out the mouse and tried to serve it, people would start vomiting at the table. But presumably, but in those days it was different. People had different relationships to the rats. It was before the bubonic plague, and people realized that they could kill people. So well, that we're going to get to that too. Yeah, so it was like okay, so the Gemara says, Amalei Rabbanan Rav Sheshes. So if that's the case, what's the case? So the Rabbanan said to Rav Sheshes. So the Rabbanan said to Rav Sheshes, Amalei Rabbanan Rav Sheshes. El Me'ata L'Tamei Lach V'Yavesh. So the Rabbanan said to Rav Sheshes, if you want to say that the taste of the mouse is its own law, and so therefore, even though it's no sin tam of gam, even though it gives off a bad taste, it's prohibited. Well, if that's the case, it transmit tuma, even though it's still dry, even though it's not moist. Now, why do we learn in the Mishnah and in the that it only gives off transmits tuma if it's dry? The Gemara says to the Rabbanan said back to Rav Sheshes, Shechva Zera to Tamilach v'Yavesh. If that's the case, Shechva Zera, male seed, should also give off tuma while it's dry. Alama Tanan, meaning to say, if the idea is that if it's disgusting and people will separate from it, then even though it's moist, even though it's dry, it should give off tumah. So should Avodah Zarah, even though it's dry. We know it's not the case. Why do we say that Avodah Zarah is metame while it's dry? The Torah says Avodah Zarah only transmits tumah if it's basically potent, if it's able to produce. But mosam also the rats, they have to be like moist and not dry. So Maskef for Rav Shimi min Ardai. So Rav Shimi min Ardai raises a question. Me moist. Why do you say that the Rav's logic that it transmits, even though it's no time of gam, it's going to be prohibited because it's a chiddush. Nobody would eat it in general. So what are you talking about? Why do we say that these rats are disgusting? We know it's a delicacy. That certain tables of kings, they eat it. So I'm Rav Shimon Ardai, will caution. No, it depends on the type of rodent. It depends if it's one in the fields. Dabra is like the wilderness or wild one. Or in the city. The city ones are disgusting, and the field ones are really good. And we don't know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about like squirrel. One time I once went I used to teach a class on the hill. So I'm sorry for those who are joining now because apologize to you for not explaining the schedule. But when it's Rosh Chodesh, we do it at sunrise. So we start right after the davening. But anyway, I once had so I taught on the hill. I used to teach some Torah class on the hill. And there was a guy there, very nice man. And he was, it was in his office. He was the chief of staff to somebody. No. This person's not Jewish. I don't want to say his name, but it was some senator, and the chief of staff was not Jewish. He was a very devout Christian, and he was hosting. He was very nice, and he would. So I said, come over to my home for a Shabbos meal, and he said that they used to eat squirrels. They lived in Virginia. They would eat squirrels. So a squirrel is a type of animal, like a rodent. So like those are delicacies that the kings serve.
We learned that the served from the king's table.
The Oel Shulchan Malachim, here, Akiva, you want to? No, tell us, Akiva. The Oel Shulchan Malachim, we know that typically speaking, we cannot eat food that's cooked by an idolater. But if it is not Oel Shulchan Malachim, if it does not go on the table of the king, then that prohibition doesn't apply. Also, it doesn't apply if it could be in raw, or also if a Jew is involved in the cooking process. So you're saying here, going back to our Gemara, why would you say a rat is noticing time of gam is prohibited because it's a chiddush, because it's disgusting, when we know that the rats are not disgusting. The kings eat them. So the Gemara says, no, it depends on the type of rat. Rav was talking about the case where the rat that fell in was a disgusting rat. So how do we paskin like this? People have a very visceral reaction to certain animals that they won't eat them, like rats. People have a lot of phobias about rats. I don't know why rats more than other animals, and also like cockroaches. People get like very viscerally opposed to it. Nosing tam of gam is mutter. He says the nosing tam of gam, the law is that if it falls into the pot, it's permitted. If that's the case, the achbara b'shichra. So then, why did Rav say that the mouse that fell into the beer mice, the rat flavored beer? Why did Rav say it's prohibited? Lo yadana my time of the Rav. I don't know why he prohibited it. Imishum the kasaver nosin tam of gam is aser. Maybe Rav's of the position that because it gives off a bad taste, it's still prohibited, and we don't paskin like that. And we don't rule like him. Or imishum the kasaver nosin tam of gam is mutter. Or maybe it's of the position that if it gives off a bad taste, it will be permitted. So if that's the case, why did he prohibit the rat in the beer? Maybe it improves it. So, okay, so that's basically today's daf. Sorry to those who joined late because of the schedule.